to a new episode of the Fearless Youth Association podcast, where we amplify stories of empowerment, resilience, and youth-driven change. In today's episode, we dive into a world often overlooked, the world of interpreting. But not just language. We're talking about interpretation as a bridge for equity, access, and community empowerment. Our guest today is Barbara from Voices in Refuge, a UK-based social enterprise that trains and employs interpreters from refugee and migrant backgrounds. Their work helps people access essential services in health, education, and law. Barbara, welcome. Thank you for being here with
Thank you
us
for having
today. So, can you tell our listeners a bit about yourself and your role at Voices in Refuge?
Sure. Thank you also for a really nice introduction to interpreting and what we do at Voices in Refuge. My role at Voices in Refuge is the head of training and development. And I've been involved with Voices in Refuge since its inception in 2016. Sort of my day-to-day work would involve training interpreters and supporting interpreters when they perform their duties, as well as look for partnerships, look for new clients, and sort of promote community interpreting.
Okay. What inspired the creation of Voices in Refuge, and what problem is it trying to solve?
Right. So Voices in Refuge is a community interest company that is owned by Nottingham Refugee Forum, which is a local charity that's been sort of providing advice and support to refugees and asylum seekers for the past 25 years. And because the Refugee Forum delivers services to people who struggle to understand English, I think about 80% of the people that we work with through through Nottingham Refugee Forum would require an interpreter to be able to fully communicate with an advisor or with another service provider. So for the longest time, we were using sort of like commercial interpreting providers that are costly, but not very effective and not very professional oftentimes. And we have also heard sort of stories from some of our clients about the Home Office or the doctors or other public service providers either not using interpreters or using really bad or unprofessional interpreters that had a direct impact on the outcome of their asylum case or the outcome of their treatment, for example. Because we knew there's a lot of bad practice out there, but at the same time, obviously, we needed interpreting services as also our work was starting to increase, as in 2015, the Refugee Forum started to do resettlement work with the Syrian families as well. So we came to a point where the forum was paying thousands of pounds per month just for interpreting services, but we were not happy with interpreting services. So our director at the time, she used to work in Egypt, and her colleague there, called Alice Johnson, set up this project, the Cairo Community Interpreter Project, and it's like her baby. And she's been basically training refugees in Cairo to become interpreters for their communities. And she's been delivering this training to UNHCR, IOM, so other international migration organizations, so to their staff. And so our director invited her to come and train staff and volunteers here in Nottingham, so part of Refugee Forum. I was one of the first 20 people who were trained as community interpreters by Alice Johnson. And this is sort of how we got rolling. So the idea was obviously for us or for Alice to upskill some of the existing staff and volunteers, but the idea was also to then adjust that training, make it relevant to the UK context, because it's quite different if you're an interpreter in Cairo or in Thailand or in Hong Kong or here in Nottingham, which is quite small, and some of the refugee and migrant communities are quite small. So yes, I was trained at that point, also with the idea of adapting that training, rolling it out, making it relevant to people who actually live in Nottingham and engage with services. The kick, and started offering training courses. Every time we offered it, we tweaked it a little bit, sort of responded to what was happening and the changes in the asylum system or changes in kind of services provided and the needs of the clients that we worked with. But we sort of have a steady pace now. Obviously, we've been doing it for 9 years. So yeah, every year we sort of train around 100-ish interpreters. Not everybody ends up being an interpreter, obviously, but we sort of give them skills, we give them some options. And as you said, we focus on training specifically people with lived experience of asylum. So we have asylum seekers who are not allowed to work, but they obviously can access training, and they can sort of prepare maybe for the time when they will have permission to work, to be able to maybe use their skills as an interpreter, turn it into a career or a side job. There's refugees who have permission to work and they want to use their language skills, do it in the right way, in a professional way, maybe do it again as a main career or as a, one of the jobs that they might be doing. We also engage sometimes international students who are completely oblivious of maybe the challenges faced by refugees and asylum seekers, including those who come from their countries. And then they bring the language skills maybe and some of academic background, but at the same time we offer them that context. So we help them understand maybe how their community members with different backgrounds are doing here when in Nottingham, maybe waiting for their asylum claim to be heard.
Okay. So you said that you train 100 persons per year.
Yeah.
So how many interpreters does the organization have in total then?
I think so. Voices in Refuge has currently, I think, 8 interpreters who are actually employed on a part-time contract, which gives them a bit of job security, because it means that they have, paid sick leave, they have paid holidays. And that's for the languages that are most widely spoken, because we can basically guarantee those minimum hours per week because we know the demand. In addition to this, we have, I think, about 30 to 40 freelancers. So everybody who works with us have completed our training. And then some of them who either speak languages that are a bit more niche or that we can't really guarantee a minimum hours per week, or those who want flexibility with their work and just maybe help out here and there. They are a part of our pool of freelance interpreters. So whenever we have a request for a specific language, for example, we can sort of spread it out, share it out between that particular language speakers to say, there's an appointment next week, let's say next Tuesday from 10 to 11, can anybody cover it? And then they're kind of free to say yes or no.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's our team.
So what are the most common languages that is required for the organization that you see persons need the most?
Yeah. I'm looking specifically at supporting refugees and asylum seekers in Nottingham and the languages they speak. Arabic, Farsi, Pashto Dari, Tigrinya and Amharic would probably be the most widely spoken languages. Oh, and Kurdish Sorani. Now, for example, Voices in Refuge obviously are not limited to only providing services to refugee forum clients or only to refugees and asylum seekers. So through Voices in Refuge, we've done also a lot of Ukrainian interpreting. Whereas Refugee Forum doesn't necessarily work with Ukrainians because they're not technically refugees. So that's another language that's popular in terms of requests coming through to Voices in Refuge.
Okay. So why was the focus on interpreting? Why is it crucial for refugees?
Like I said earlier, the vast majority of asylum seekers and refugees would not speak very good English, or even if they have some English, they would perhaps not be confident to fully express themselves or fully understand other people when they're kind of accessing different services. And community interpreting in the UK is a very grey area. It's not very well regulated. Pretty much anybody can wake up in the morning and say, I can be an interpreter. I'm going to go sign up with an agency. I'm going to tell them I speak these languages. They won't necessarily check to what extent I can speak those languages. They won't check whether I understand what the role entails, how to do it, whether I've ever received any training, or whether I've ever, if I have any experience of it before. We've heard of some of our trainees who said before they even came to our training, they literally signed up with an agency, and on the same day, they sent them to a hospital for an appointment without any checks, without anything. They literally signed the contract and went to do their first job, which is really poor practice. So sort of like our bigger idea at Voices in Refuge is to try um, to improve the quality of community interpreting and also to increase expectations of everybody involved. Because right now, a lot of service providers, doctors, solicitors, home office officials, they don't know what the good standards are. They just want somebody who speaks the languages, but not necessarily know what to expect of them. And because the quality varies so much and because the expectations are so low, there's a lot of people out there who claim to be interpreters, but they're doing a really poor job. And they can actually have a life or death
Right.
situation they have an impact on, and they don't even realize that. So we're sort of on a mission to improve the level of community interpreting, one trained interpreter at a time, set some standards, both for interpreters themselves, but also hopefully increase the expectations of service providers, knowing what to expect from a good trained interpreter, so that they will not be okay with just a random person who claims to be an interpreter do their job in a sort of dodgy way.
Yeah. So you've kind of answered this question, but I'll just say it again. What are some of the daily challenges faced by refugees and non-English speakers in the UK?
I mean, obviously, the biggest issue we are trying to address is the language barrier, which
Yeah.
exists in any sort of migration experience. And it's oftentimes not really acknowledged, or it's not at the center of a service provided to them. So it's baffling to me that there are organizations out there that specifically work with, let's say, refugees or migrants, but they deliver everything in English, and they're like, oh, if you don't speak the language, we can't help you, or oh, we'll
Right.
just use a bit of Google Translate. And
Yeah.
that's not really a good professional way of dealing with a client or with a customer.
Right.
So that's kind of the obvious thing that we're trying to resolve. But then there's also sometimes sort of the perception of the general public that refugees and asylum seekers are lazy and stupid, they don't want to learn the language, why don't they speak English? Well, it takes a long time to learn a language. And
Yeah, of
whilst,
course.
yes, there's a lot of great providers of ESOL and other forms of education out there, it takes time. And until they are ready to be able to fully speak up for themselves in English, they need some support through an interpreter, and we need to be able to trust that person they're actually passing the messages correctly. But on a larger scale, just generally, the asylum system is very complicated. The government or the Home Office is doing the bare minimum. So they might provide accommodation, they might provide food, or they might provide like a small allowance, but there's the day-to-day stuff, like how do systems work? How does the NHS work? How do I register with a GP? Why do I need to register with a GP? Who can I speak about my mental health with? Or what are my responsibilities as an asylum seeker? So there's all these questions, sometimes very small things that maybe for a local person or somebody who speaks fluent English, you wouldn't even think about it, or you would Google and you would know. But for a lot of asylum seekers and refugees, it could be very essential questions. And if they don't know where to go for help, or if they know whom to speak with, or if don't have the language to be able to work things out, then it just means they either don't have access to services, or they get substandard services because they're not fully listened to or fully included in the conversation. I mean, there is prejudice, there's racism. We've had clients who literally were turned away from services because maybe, they couldn't fully express themselves, or because they were from a particular background. There's the general public, obviously, that has quite a negative view of asylum seekers and refugees, and that feeds into how they feel in the society. And maybe there's a level of kind of anxiety, perhaps, also kind of reaching out for help because they never know whether the people will respond in a positive and a negative way. So these are just some of the things that they're dealing with on a daily basis.
How do interpreting services help close the gap between communities and public services like healthcare and education?
it's just allowing people to freely express themselves and also understand the systems and understand the directions and the instructions they receive from service providers. As I said earlier, a lot of times the public services, even though they have the legal responsibility to provide interpreting services to their clients or patients,
I didn't even know that.
they do not always do this, or they try to wiggle out of their responsibility because obviously it costs money.
Yeah.
It's a professional, highly skilled service that costs money. And with everybody sort of being stretched financially, they're trying to avoid it. Or, sometimes public services would say to our clients, oh, just bring a friend who speaks your language, or bring, a family member, which is unethical, unprofessional. So yeah, this happens quite frequently. But again, our stance from Voices in Refuge is that you can't just use a random person. You need to have somebody who's trained and understands the gravity of the role of a community interpreter. Because in any setting, they're the only person in the room who understands everything that is being said. And both the service user and the service provider put their full trust in them that they will be interpreting accurately and completely. It's a huge responsibility. That's why I believe it's important that interpreters do receive training and have a good understanding of what the role entails, because it's a really important role for the communities. Bear in mind, a lot of interpreters themselves have been through the process, are part of the refugees or asylum-seeking communities. So they come with the understanding of why it's so important to do the job well, and sort of, I guess, enjoy a good reputation in their community because they are there to help bridge that communication gap between the communities and the public services in a professional way, so that they sort of like represent their communities and help them at the same time.
Can you share a powerful or moving story from your experience that stayed with you?
It's mainly sort of secondhand stories, because it's people that we work with who come to us and then say, oh, I've had a really, really bad experience with an interpreter, and I want to make sure that going forward, maybe we use your interpreters because we trust them, because we know that they're trained. I know of situations where literally people were refused asylum because the interpreter that the Home Office booked was adding things to what the asylum seeker was saying. So we know of a case, I don't know the exact details, but in a nutshell, there was, I believe, a Pakistani asylum seeker who converted from Islam to Christianity, and that was their basis for their asylum claim, because they were persecuted based on the fact that they're a member of a minority religion. The interpreter that was booked by the Home Office was a Muslim Pakistani interpreter. And again, this is not about religions, just to clarify, or like a clash of religions. But what has happened is that whenever the asylum seeker was talking about, their kind of religious journey, whenever they were mentioning the name of God and the name of the Prophet, the interpreter, who was Muslim, sort of added things, because I think, I'm sorry if I get this incorrectly, but I think whenever the Prophet's name is mentioned, you have to say like peace be upon him afterwards. So the interpreter was adding things because he, as a Muslim, sort of felt compelled to add that because that's part of their religion and their culture. Yeah. But the asylum seeker didn't actually say that. Now, the Home Office interviewer was kind of listening to what the interpreter was saying, and kind of came to a conclusion that the person is probably not actually converted, because every time they talk about God, every time they talk about the Prophet, they're saying these things that the Muslims are saying. So they didn't believe the asylum seeker that they actually converted or they're actually persecuted based on their religion, and they refused their case. It was only later, when the interview was sort of reviewed by a solicitor and they get a transcript, they realized all these things were added to it. And even if it wasn't malicious, it was just, like the interpreter sort of adding things that actually derailed the interview. And actually, as I said, it could be a life or death situation. And in
Yeah, of
this case, it could be
course.
a death situation for the person if they were to be sent back.
Yeah.
Luckily, I think it was rectified at later stage, at appeal stage.
Okay.
But it's just one of the examples where interpreters are not perhaps fully aware of the gravity of the role and the strict necessity to be neutral and impartial and not really put any of your personality or personal background into it. You literally just have to stick to the message as it is, because otherwise things can go horribly wrong.
Yeah.
So this is just one of the examples that we're aware of. And there's situations where one of our trained interpreters went to court with their friend as a supporter, not as an interpreter. And the court-appointed interpreter didn't show up for the session. So the judge just went, "Oh, does anybody in the room speak Kurdish Sorani?" And then our colleague went, "Yeah." And the judge just said, "Oh, can you please just interpret for this gentleman so we can get on with the session?" And that was a completely unprofessional thing to do. And we were all slightly horrified, but the good thing is that he was actually a trained interpreter, so he
Yeah.
could do a good job. But the reality is sort of the expectation or the law, let's say, around providing interpreting services and what it's supposed to look like versus what happens on the ground is very different. So all these things motivate us to keep on going and keep on changing the landscape.
So what are some of the requirements then for an interpreter?
Right. You mean those who come and train with us through
Yeah.
Voices in Refuge? Right. So, as I said, we do focus on training asylum seekers and refugees primarily. And we do understand that some of them will not have an academic background or have achieved particular academic qualification. In fact, recently, we had a trainee who has never went to school, has never accessed any sort of formal education, and coming to our training was their first time sort of sitting in a classroom and engaging in education, and they did brilliantly. They were a bit overwhelmed, and I didn't understand why at the start, because they didn't share with us their backstory, but they were able to get through the training and they actually did really well. So for us, it's not so much about, let's say, academic background or academic achievements. What we focus on is people who are sort of already put in that position. Oftentimes, they sort of naturally emerge in their communities as the person who speaks the most fluent English, or maybe they are in some way a leader in their community. They end up sort of interpreting for friends and family anyway. So we encourage them to come to our training so they learn about the specific techniques, and they also understand, again, the context of the role, how to set boundaries, how to protect themselves and look after their own well-being as well. That's a huge part of the role. So obviously they do need to have like a good level of English. I'm not perfect, nobody's perfect, but they have to be fluent enough between English and at least one community language so they can pass messages back and forth with a good degree of fluency. And
So,
yeah.
Have you ever had to turn someone away from interpreting? Like, for example, with that individual who kept saying "peace be upon you." Is it an instance where sometimes someone religion can affect like their role as an interpreter?
During the course, we have a lot of conversations about, again, that neutrality and impartiality of the interpreter. And we do recognize that there are people who, they come to the course, but they feel extremely challenged in some ways. Yeah. So for some, like we've had trainees who said, well, I can never tell a lie. And we try to kind of have those conversations around, well, it's not you saying that, you're transferring somebody else's conversation. It's not your opinion. It's not your lie to tell, so to speak. Or yes, people who are deeply religious, can that deeply religious interpreter, again, sort of step away from themselves and be objective and just pass the message without feeling like it's something that they are
Personal,
saying.
yeah.
And for some, they can't get over this, and they might choose not to be an interpreter and maybe choose a different role. So it does take a lot of thinking about the role, and kind of a resolution that, yes, if I am going to be an interpreter, I will have to follow certain rules, and I sort of have to take myself out of the situation. My judgments, my beliefs, my opinions don't matter when I'm an interpreter. I'm literally in the service of other people's messages. So yeah, we occasionally have people who during the training course realize that's actually not for them. But we haven't had anybody who has come through the training that we would have a concern that they would be sort of like adding things or being being in any way hindered or not doing their job properly. It usually happens in the training process.
So I think what I'm trying to understand is that obviously it's all about language, but with language comes different cultural differences. So do you guys also account for different cultural context when you're training these interpreters?
I see. We do, but at the same time, we always try to remind our interpreters that even if they share a culture or a background with, let's say, their community member, they can't make assumptions, they know of other people's experience of that culture.
Right.
So very narrowly, the interpreters literally just focus on the messages that were spoken, that were said, and they can't add their own
Right.
interpretation, like their own understanding of other people's cultures to it, because there's even diversity within one single culture. And even if two people have completely similar backgrounds, the way they experience life, culture, religion will be different.
Okay.
So the interpreters always just focus on passing messages as they were said without adding or deleting or modifying anything. And that's again part of the process, because sometimes interpreters believe they have to be advocates for a community, advocates for a particular culture, give the extra explanations of the cultural context. But that would not make them neutral and impartial. That would make them be a part of a conversation or
Right.
being an advocate.
Yeah.
And this is not the role of the interpreter. So sometimes we need to sort of pull them back and say, yes, maybe this is what you would want to say, but as an interpreter, you are passing other people's messages, not your own opinions. So it's another challenge that sometimes interpreters face, knowing to, kind of sort of step back and not make assumptions and really just deal with the messages as they were said.
Okay. What challenges do newly trained interpreters face on the ground? So I'm assuming what you just said is one of them.
Yes, and even when we do training, a big part of the training is role play. Yeah, we want them to learn about the techniques and then apply them in practice. So I'm in every session we do like an hour's role play where they will support each other. So somebody is an interpreter, somebody is a service provider, somebody a service user, and they sort of enact close to real life scenario and try to challenge each other by maybe speaking fast or speaking complex language or learning in that way. But it's all still a safe environment, and they sort of want to help each other and not make it too complicated. But once they finish the training and once they start working or volunteering, it's real life. And you can't sort of roll back and you can't laugh about it because it's happening. And community interpreting is happening in real time and real space. So they will have to deal with the challenges and have to think quickly, think on the spot, apply all the techniques, everything they've learned in the course, all the practice we've done, and try to do their best. So it sort of, I think it takes a little bit of practice, a little bit of confidence building to get to a point where they'll be like really good interpreters. So that's something that is needed sort of after the training. And we try to create that platform, obviously through Voices in Refuge and in collaboration with Nottingham Refugee Forum and other local organizations that we work with, making sure they've got that practice. Maybe start with slightly simpler appointments or kind of simpler conversations, and build up their confidence and skills and vocabulary to eventually be able to maybe interpret, let's say, in a legal setting, a meeting with a solicitor, or maybe something that is really challenging, even for experienced interpreters, is interpreting in mental health settings. So mental health assessments or therapy or these kinds of things are quite challenging. Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to ask you a few questions about yourself,
Sure.
if that's okay. What inspired you most about the work that you do, and do you feel like the work has changed you, and how?
um, Well, I initially got involved with Voices in Refuge or I was identified as a good person to get involved because I'm a language buff. So
Okay.
I'm I speak several languages, not at the level that I could interpret between, but I have sort of worked professionally with Slovene, which is my mother tongue, English, and Mandarin, which is something that I studied at university. And I have a few other languages. Just generally, I'm interested in language and communication across cultures. So that was sort of my basis. And then kind of having these conversations, even before Voices in Refuge
Yeah.
started, it just made sense. At that point, I was coordinating the volunteers at Nottingham Refugee Forum, and I knew that there's such a powerful resource, people from the community who speak multiple languages, who could use those languages for their communities and for the greater good. So all of this sort of inspired me to get involved. Then there's the other thing. I like attention. I like limelight. So I like being in front of an audience and tell them how
Okay.
they need to do things without me having to do the hard work. So I guess everything just merged into this role that I have now, that I've had with Voices in Refuge. For a long time, unofficially, I used to sort of do it on the side, sort of snuck it into my job because it was necessary. But it's inspiring. Every time we start a new course, you've got like 15, 20 people who are a bit starry-eyed, a bit like not quite sure what it's going to be. And then throughout the course, you see how they grow in confidence. You sort of have those light bulb moments when they realize, oh, this is how I'm supposed to do things. Or like, oh, this is why I had issues when I was interpreting for my mother, because I wasn't setting the boundaries
Yeah,
correctly.
yeah.
And you also see people who maybe had completely different professional backgrounds, then get inspired to go into interpreting and really want to do well and do extra training and do extra work, and they really flourish in this career. So I could say we have changed many lives, even if that meant, okay, maybe I'm not going to be an interpreter, but I know what to expect from an interpreter, and I will know what to demand and what kind of service I need if I need an interpreter personally. Or there's people who have been through the training, and as I said, it may be the first training or the first educational setting they've ever been in, and they did well and they felt encouraged to continue. We've had people who completed the training and then got a job as an interpreter, which was their first job in the UK.
Wow.
And they went from there. Maybe they interpreted for a few years. We have quite a few of our interpreters actually who, after a period of time, moved on to do casework. So we have some of them started off as interpreters, are now caseworkers for resettled refugees. One of them even is a team leader in a different local authority. So it can be a starting point or first stepping stone professionally for a lot of people who struggle to get their foot in the door in the UK because they don't have that local experience. So I'm really proud of the lives that we've changed, of the interpreters themselves, but obviously the secondary impact, if you like, is also of those refugees and asylum seekers who benefited from a good quality interpreting service, and making sure that they're heard and they're communicated with properly. So I'm proud of our work, really.
Yeah, you should be. So how can people support your work at Voices in Refuge?
Um, if you're a public service, if you're a local organization that works with refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants, think about interpreting, work it into your services. Don't rely on hands and loud English and Google Translate, because that's not a right way to communicate with somebody.
Yeah.
And I know this is maybe long-term thing because people have budgets, they need to plan ahead. But I would strongly encourage anyone who's providing a service to refugees or asylum seekers or migrants to consider using professional interpreters. Obviously, I would say, yes, come to us, we'll give you a good deal. But yeah, I mean, this is one way of supporting us.
Yeah.
Booking our interpreters and ensuring that the people that work with have access to interpreting services. Um, if anyone is bilingual, so speaks English and another language fluently and is considering maybe exploring interpreting as a career, they're welcome to come on one of our training courses. They are free because we've received generous funding from the City Council. We've got some funding from the, I forgot what they're called, National Grid Foundation, something like this. So we have 3 more courses this year scheduled that are free of charge. Obviously, priority goes to people with lived experience of forced migration, but other people from the community or sort of second generation migrants are also welcome to join us. So they can go onto our website to see more information about how to apply and when the courses are happening. But that's a way also, not helping us necessarily, but helping the communities and helping Voices in Refuge grow. And again, the standard of community interpreting improving across the board.
Okay. So my last question for you is, what's the first step you would recommend for a young person who wants to get into community work or interpreting?
Well, for interpreting, for us, like the first requirement is to come and do our course. So it's a 20-hour course where we outline the specific skills, the specific tools that an interpreter needs, put it into a context, again, so they understand the importance of the role, the challenges of the role, how to set boundaries, how to look after themselves. And this could be a starting point. Beyond completing the course, if they're not ready to work, I would always recommend volunteering, just to give it a try and see whether this is something that might work. And just generally being sort of in touch with what's happening locally, learning about it, getting the right resources or the right sources to get the facts and know what challenges communities are facing. Like I said earlier, sometimes we work with international students or even local students who are completely detached with what's happening in other parts of the city, people with different backgrounds. The asylum system or asylum seekers as a whole are very misunderstood, misrepresented in the media, in the public discourse. So generally, I would always say, try to have a conversation with somebody face to face, one-on-one, get to know them, hear it from them, and then decide whether you want to trust the media or if you want to believe those narratives or make up your own mind. That's for those who are particularly interested in working with refugees and asylum seekers. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Barbara, for sharing your story with us. It was very inspiring, very passionate, and full of purpose. And to our listeners, remember, your voice, your language, and your experience are not limitations, they're your superpower. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with someone who needs to hear it. See you next time. Bye.